Just a note before I start today's episode, I realized I failed to state during it that Paradox, owner of the World of Darkness and licensor to the community content portal Storyteller Vault, is disallowing the use of generative AI art tools in Storyteller Vault publications starting in mid-February. This is requiring a number of Storyteller Vault authors to take down work and, if they want to make it available again, rework the text, remove the non-compliant pieces, and repost it. This month I'm doing interviews with at least 2 creators whose work I feel benefits from the breadth of generative tools to generate things like space werewolves. If you grab these titles before they are taken down, you'll be able to get a fully illustrated copy if you save it locally somewhere. If you've held off on getting titles because you don't like generative AI art tools, that's fine. Anything on the vault after mid-February should be free of it, so I hope you then choose to grab any titles that looked interesting to you, but you were holding off on because of the AI art content. Regardless of your thoughts on AI art tools, I think Hal and I had a good conversation on Mage and Werewolf Deep Umbra games, and with that, on with the show. Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson with Mage the Podcast. Joining me today is Storyteller Vault author, as well as illustrator and multimedia artist, Hal Case. Hal has authored 2 pieces that I thought were gorgeous and interesting and big and bold, and those are the kind of community content creators I want to bring to the fore. Hal himself is a capable artist, and you may want to grab these titles before future versions coming out by February remove some of those artistic elements, because if you're looking for something where generative tools really knock it out of the park, the chain of angry space werewolf pursued by monster is something that technology is surprisingly good at helping you along with. We'll talk more about Hal's creative process and how it worked into his artistic workflow. But first off, Hal, how you doing?
I'm pretty good. I'm fighting bronchitis, but that's all right.
You got a cat in your lap, though, so that's
Yes, I've got 4 of them. And I may at some point, you may see a 5-year-old come streaming through here.
Entirely
She's not
fine.
Yet out of bed.
Yeah, we have a low-pass filter to just remove the high-pitched scream as they run through. So you did at least 2 books that I know of, Umbral Pilots and The Shipyard.
Yes. I also worked on Dead Ends with Charles Siegel.
Oh, wonderful. I found that book very enjoyable.
I wrote the Celestial Chorus chapter.
So what are these 2 books, and why did you do this to yourself? Because combined it's like 280 pages. That's a lot, and you don't use large font. You don't cheat. You didn't do 12-point Verdana double spaced.
Right. So these books, so why did I do these things to myself? Back in, 1995, when Glasswalker's first tribe book came out, it had like a 2-paragraph blurb on this group called the Umbral Pilots, who were, from that moment and have been forever, the coolest thing that could possibly exist in Werewolf the Apocalypse. And yet across 4 editions, the game has given us a grand total of 7 paragraphs about these guys. The moment I saw these, I was like, where are the rules for the Umbra ships? And there weren't any. And then, I have a long-running Werewolf/Mage crossover chronicle going. It has traveled around a bit, but one of the areas it spent a lot of its time, and most it's currently located in, is in Los Angeles. And for those that are aware into really obscure werewolf lore, the original Los Angeles by Night book for Vampire has mentioned that the werewolves have a cairn in Pasadena that's integrated with Caltech and with JPL. That's got to be Umbral Pilots. And so I actually brought that sept in, I gave it a name, and it's part of my chronicle. And then a new player came into my game, and he wanted to run a rogue void engineer. And once he fled from technocracy and was getting help from the group, they started talking, they need to do this Umbral quest that's coming up. And he says, point of order, if I'm going to remember, I need a ship. And there was this collective, the players. Then one of them goes, wait a second, we know some people with ships. At which point I go, oh crap, I wrote a check for this idea like 10 years ago, and now I got to cash it.
So quick point of information, who are the Glasswalkers, and kind of what is their deal, and what is JPL?
Sure. JPL is Jet Propulsion Laboratories. It is an organization that's tied in with NASA. They designed, for example, the Curiosity rover that was so much fun going around on Mars. They're involved in the space program. And part of Evil LA by Night was that the Glasswalkers helped found JPL, and so were the Void Engineers. And this is this really interesting thing in that book about how basically the Glasswalkers and Void Engineers are up to their eyeballs in JPL and Caltech and each other, and they actively ignore each other's presence. I can just picture this guy talking to a supervisor, this Void Engineer. Hey, I'm pretty sure that Jenkins is lycanthropy. Shh. He's doing good work on the rover. Don't touch it.
That really feels like one of those things where you invoke like the American with Disabilities Act, where you're like, pursuant to our HR policies, we cannot discuss the presence or absence of lycanthropy within the aforementioned employee unless it pertains to application of duties.
Exactly.
To me, JPL, the Jet Propulsion Lab, is interesting. The Mage connection there, in my mind, is Jack Parsons. So Jack Parsons, this absolute polymath, where it's like noted as rocket engineer slash chemist slash material science slash thelema occultist. Thelema being the magical system, I don't know if invented, but at least popularized by Aleister Crowley. Died at the age of 37 in I think a backyard rocket incident that some people thought was a suicide. Other people thought it was a murder. Other people were like, he's playing with rockets. What did you think would happen? And in my headcanon, every tradition, convention, and craft has records indicating that Jack Parsons is one of their members. They don't necessarily believe them, but it's one of those things where it's like, nope, the Order of Hermes are like, oh, son of a gun, we got a membership card for you. Like the Sisters of Hippolyta are like, no, he's a member in good standing somehow. And,
he's their Rasputin.
Yeah, and a more interesting one, in my opinion, because at the end of the day, he sealed the deal. He actually made the rockets. Are rockets something that naturally fit into what you would consider to be the theme and mood of Werewolf? Is this a tongue-in-cheek thing? Because in Mage, when we talk about spaceships, once you get a critical distance from Earth, they are kind of necessary logistically. Do werewolves spend a lot of time in the Deep Umbra? And if they're not using a spaceship, how do they get around?
One of the things that's interesting in Werewolf is they're actually not really necessary. Werewolves have been going into the Deep Umbra as long as werewolves have existed. They don't spend a lot of time there because it's weird and twisty and it's kind of far from most of their duties, but they do go there. In fact, it's actually a lot easier for a Garou to get there than it is for mages. Mages require Spirit 5. Garou require a level 2 right. You can start play able to go to the Deep Umbra straight out. So they've been literally walking there for a long, long time. The W20 Umbra book has some really nice descriptions of the Deep Umbra as this chaotic realm where everything changes constantly. It's not necessarily outer space to them. Some will encounter it that way.
Yeah, on the Mage side, we kind of have two major ways of getting to the Deep Umbra. One is you start on the mud ball, you hit the launch button, you take a mundane rocket, or what appears to be a mundane rocket, into place, you get kind of far from Earth, and then you move across a very thin gauntlet. This is complicated for the pedants in the audience by Revised, which has some commentary that suggests that at a certain distance from Earth, the Umbra and mundane reality are kind of the same thing, and there's this phenomenon called Tegmark lensing that prevents mundane or sleepers from seeing through it. This leads to a lot of really complicated things because we know there are horrors kind of deep out there that Earth needs to be protected from. So the question is, how do sleepers just not see it? And then suddenly Tegmark lensing is doing a lot. And then we have the idea of the anthropic horizon, that like kind of the furthest a person has gotten to or our stuff has gotten to defines mundane reality. And we have the Voyager probe, which has now gone past the heliopause or what have you. The other way of kind of getting into the Deep Umbra for Mage is to go into the Penumbra. You go into the Near Umbra, one of the three Umbrae. You go up to the Ethereal reaches. Each of the Near Umbra areas has kind of a up that you go to, which gets you past Horizon, which is the barrier between the near and the far, the near and the Deep Umbra. You then either, depending on which cosmology you're using, you then go through ether space, which is kind of this fun inland sea area where you have ether ships and people on magic carpets and other people riding pterodactyls and so on, until you get to the far horizon or true horizon. Again, naming conventions vary depending on what edition you're doing. You navigate.
And who wrote it?
Yeah. You navigate an anchorhead. And then you're out there. That's kind of that Spirit 5 that you mentioned. Right. It can also be done with Mind 5, but that also kind of raises its own issues as well. But yeah, to the point, for mages, it done be hard.
Right. And werewolves have been able to get out there for an awfully long time. One of the things that's interesting for werewolves getting out there is that there are anchorheads to the Deep Umbra all over a lot of the Near Realm. So you can just walk through an air and get to a realm, then find a way into the Deep Umbra from there. The most common one, the way that where most of the known anchorheads to the Deep Umbra are, is you mentioned the Ethereal reaches. The Garou have the Ethereal reaches too. They call it, in fact, it came from a first edition Werewolf book before Mage was even published, I believe. But they call it the Ethereal Realm. And so Garou will go to the Ethereal Realm, which is the astrological heaven. It's space as imagined by a demented, drunk astrologer. And you can literally get there by going on a mountaintop, jumping on a cloud, and walking. You could pull yourself up by your bootstraps to get there, quite literally.
Yeah, the methods of access to the Ethereal realm are wildly imaginative. If you want to have 200 birthday balloons, if you want to have a flock of trained crows, if you want to have a giant Wile E. Coyote-style catapult, all of these work. And I find it hilarious that Mage specifically mentions that the Ethereal reaches do not allow for technology, despite the fact that a bone gnar can assemble, like with rubber bands and bubblegum, like this rocket-powered sky car.
Yes.
And it just works.
Yes.
And the other comment you make is regarding the astrological heavens, which I think is a great way of putting it, because a werewolf has its own zodiacal system, which is interesting and fascinating. See Werewolf, the podcast discussion of Rage Across the Heavens, or just go to the White Wolf Wiki.
I love that book. It's so weird.
Yeah. And the thing I love about it is, to the best of my knowledge, it is untied to human cultures in terms of how it depicts various signs and symbols of astrology. It may be informed by it, but it doesn't gank from anyone in particular, so you can't do it wrong. And I always like when something is made up kind of from whole cloth, because I don't have to worry about that.
The Garou, if you want to go to the Deep Umbra, they usually will go to the Ethereal Realm. And a lot of the more powerful Kairns actually have like a link to an anchorhead. So they can go straight to these anchorheads. The Garou are actually guarding these things. And they'll go to the Ethereal Realm and they'll find an anchorhead into the Deep Umbra. And you can fly across the Ethereal Realm by power of will alone. Or you can run on moon paths and things. So you're running across what's sort of outer space while breathing, and it's all fine. But so then they get out there. Now the distances are enormous, and it's easier to do it with a spaceship, but you can without. And so the Umbral Pilots are a group of glasswalkers, which the technological, they're once known as the Warders of Man. I had one NPC once described them as the monkey's uncles. They were the Garou that looked after humanity and that interacted and interfaced the most with human culture and human technology. There's a group that the writers of Glasswalker's original tribe book clearly love, but that didn't easily fit in a lot of the rest of the setting. These are the Umbral Pilots. By the time Revised rolls around, it's fairly clear the writers are not super comfortable with them. In fact, the in-character narration of the guy talking about them says, I don't like talking about these guys. I just kind of hope they'd go away. I actually referenced that discussion in Umbral Pilots, where one of the narrators was apparently privy to that conversation. As they were trying to become so much more serious in Revised at points, they were kind of uncomfortable with the kind of the wackier first and second edition elements. I kind of really wanted to explore some of the interstices and edges of the themes that exist in Werewolf, and how you can explore some of those themes and some of those things in different ways, and can depart from them in ways that are fun and yet still congruent with the setting. And we've been going through some really crazy times, really depressing times. Our world is arguably a dystopia now. And so it's kind of nice to have something in the world of darkness, which is itself a dystopia, that maybe has a little bit of hope in it. And that was one of the things that I really enjoyed about working on Umbral Pilots. The book began as just a set of rules on Umbra ships so I could accommodate my chronicle. But I suddenly had 45 pages of these things and went, you know what, to really make this better, I need to write some more of the pilots themselves. And next thing I knew, I had 150 some odd page manuscript, and had been researching 12 different books to source it, and had this book. To your question about getting across it, why do they need ships? They technically don't need them to get there. They sure make it a lot more comfortable journey. They make it a faster journey. They make it a safer journey. And if you're going into the Deep Umbra, you need all the edges you can get. And so the Umbral Pilots came into existence in the 19th century as this group that wanted to explore the Deep Umbra because they were realizing that the apocalypse was coming and that things were not going well. And they wanted to find a way to save Guy. And they're like, our people have always known the Deep Umbra, but we haven't known it well enough. There's got to be something out there that'll help. But exploring this thing is really hard. We are the age of industry. We can figure things out. And so they decided to figure things out and find some better ways to get there. And along the way, the Umbra ships technology came into being.
So within the canon of Werewolf, we do have the idea that Umbra ships exist. That itself is not created from whole cloth. And you point out it takes a while. So to get real deep out there, there's a couple of avenues that we kind of have at our disposal. One would be to go through the dreaming. The far dreaming terminates in the Deep Umbra. There's probably a way to go from the far dreaming to the far Umbra. That is a journey of varying length. You have the ability to do something like to take the null zone, but there you're moving at the speed of walking. And they talk about it literally taking millennia if you want to get to some of the more distant ones. And in fact, in Mage Revised, it talks about like you have to use strong magic or technology if you want to go anywhere of interest, generally past Jupiter. Like mundane-ish and semi-magical methods will get you out to there, but to go any further, again, with each planet, you're roughly doubling the distance. It can take quite a bit. The other one would be, as you had mentioned, to take advantage of kind of connections and portals between zones. One of the interesting things in Mage is we don't really have portals directly into the Deep Umbra. It's something the game is pretty consistent on. So you got to have kind of some method of transit to do it out there. And I like the idea of introducing werewolves because it suddenly allows you to do something Deep Umbra-y without either A, giving characters access to their own darn spaceship. One of the things that always got me is when you have to spend like character creation points to get a spaceship or something like that. Because there are very few regular problems, I'll say, that are solved by a spaceship that aren't just spaceship-based problems. Like, if your group has a spaceship, it's now a game about your group having a spaceship. It's not a game about them being like, well, we're having problems with this unicorn infestation. We're going to solve it with a spaceship. No, that's not how that works. The Glasswalker, the tribe as you described, may be a little bit more amenable to human mages. One of the recurring themes that pops up is kind of the view of mages as humans that got a little bit too big for their britches, that to werewolves it's like you wouldn't do magic if you knew it was good for you. What's the term of art that they use in Werewolf for it? Like name breakers?
Namers and name breakers.
To me, my view is always the mages were the cattle that were smart enough to see that they were being herded. And they said, no, we are big. We can take down these fences.
And the Garou resent that.
Yes. For good or for ill, we can say that was a good thing. And just another point of note, to translate into mage terms, cairns are gathering places generally for werewolves because they are places where it is easier to access the Umbra and tends to have a lot of what mages would refer to as quintessence to them.
I love the idea that the difference between nodes and cairns is great. You know, how all cairns are nodes, but not all nodes are cairns. What really makes a node into a cairn is that it's gone through the rite of cairn building and it now has a totem spirit or patron in more modern terminology use, I suppose, that is guarding it. So there's now a big spirit squatting on it that's made this home. It's the nodeness of it is kind of more explicit. And so I think they're actually really cool settings for games and really cool. You can do really cool stuff with cairns.
And I always wanted there to be a story of a cairn where it's one of those things where what is the relationship between a sept and a pack and a cairn is kind of analogous to the relationship between a chantry, a cabal, and a node. But
Roughly,
again, not quite.
Roughly.
Yeah, where there would be a cairn whose guardian werewolves had all been killed, and a bunch of mages and a bunch of just like orphan mages are like, we will be your werewolves. And the totem spirit, again, totem we are using in a game term, not as a specific reference to the Algonquin spiritual belief.
Correct. I do like the shift to patron that has been happening in the fandom lately.
Yeah. Spirit patron or something like that, I think is a perfectly good one. The T word is still useful just because it's also a mechanical thing. So it's capital T totem, which is useful. And there's a big long list of them where there's a bunch of orphans that are like, we'll be your pack. And
we'll do it.
Yeah, and the Cairn Spirit's like, well, better than the Black Spiral Dancers. I guess this will have to do in the meantime.
In one of the old World of Darkness book, first edition, there is a cairn where this in Japan, I think it is, where Garou and mages have got a timeshare arrangement over a cairn, basically. I can't remember whether it's monthly or something, but they rotate which group is managing this cairn. And my group, one of their ambitions is they want to build a cairn collaboratively with mages where everybody's kind of working together on this because of some of the really weird themes of this particular chronicle.
And it's kind of interesting because at the end of the day, frequently the two groups are using these sources of quintessence or gnosis in remarkably similar ways, but they're uncomfortable with how the other group talks about it. In the same way that, like, as a little kid, you can be really excited to see grandma because every time you do, she gives you $10. You don't want to refer to grandma as, yep, got time to go visit the retired bank. And you're like, okay, you could say that inside, but you can't say it out loud. So like the Garou are very much interested in the access to like the spiritual benefits of it. But also at the end of the day, it is a place to rest and revive and refill that Gnosis gas tank. My final recommendation regarding patron spirits is just look through the wiki and look at some of them because they are remarkable inspiration. Clashing
great.
Boom Boom. No game is complete without
Absolutely.
without considering Clashing Boom Boom as a potential patron spirit.
Also, there are some references in some of the books to how the patron spirits or totems have many different aspects. You could have Clashing Boom Boom. There's a mention in one place of where one of her alternate titles is Saint Michael. So you could have a Clashing Boom Boom pack, who's actually their totem avatar is Saint Michael with the sword, the one that strikes down the dragon, because it's a spirit of war and violence and weaponry. And so you could have extremely different versions of the same totem.
I just like the idea of an umbral spirit that appears in the form of a stealth bomber.
Yes.
And that's kind of,
it's so cool.
kind of the important part. So we've answered the question of why spaceships? They allow you to cover vast distances quickly. It's a technology that has been used in Mage narratively. In Mage history, around 1895, we have the first spaceships that land on the moon and so on. The technocracy discovers Autochthonia. What did Garou use to get really far out there before spaceships?
There's some really cool. I referenced in my book that some of the ancient Geta Fenris used longships and sailed them up the world tree, for example.
Oh, that's neat.
Also, you have early on, the early Umbral Pilots, before they really had access to rocketry, they were doing things like building ironclad and sailing them into the Umbral seas. They were using hot air balloons. There were a couple of them. There's mention of one of them built a giant cannon that would launch you into out in there. They tried all these different technologies. But then as rocketry, that very quickly kind of became the preferred technology for them. There even still are other ways of doing it. And sometimes they're more convenient based off the particulars of some realms they want to go to, where they might want to use a different kind of conveyance. And submarines are another good one, because you can go into the Deep Umbra through the ocean, through trenches and things, which is a very cool idea, where you can sail a submarine out past Jupiter.
I'm here for it. And within Mage, we have kind of a similar progression. Before we had spaceships, we had balloons that could do it. Stay tuned for our upcoming World of Darkness balloon episode with our sister podcast,
awesome.
Changing the Podcast. But yeah, we have skyriggers as a thing. Another common one is to have some sort of spirit agreement that some spirit of speed or journey or destination would get you there.
Moon paths.
Which is something that mages, in very special circumstances, have the ability to access. Moon bridges and moon paths being direct umbral connections that are generally guarded by loons, which are these spirits of Luna, which are kind of these vibrating strings of light, which are always an interesting encounter because the mage is like, I don't know what to do.
Even what the loon's personality is varies by what time of the month. Literally, a loon that's in the new moon phase will be almost invisible because there's so little light, and it's going to want to trick the crap out of you. Meanwhile, a loon, it's on the full moon, the loon is belligerent and is in your face and very direct. What do you want? Why are you here?
Bygone Bestiary has a number of recommendations for things that can be done. I like the idea that someone would mount a umbral manta ray and kind of just glide out into the Deep Umbra there. Why do the Garou go to the Deep Umbra? What is there for them? You had made mention to exploring and protecting Gaia and seeing what else is out there. What other motives exist for kind of getting out there?
Well, one of the big ones is one of the big ones for humanity. It's curiosity. They want to find out what's out there, but also they're on a mission. The Garou collectively are trying to protect Gaia, but most of them in the modern era are kind of convinced it's a lost cause, and they're kind of like hunkering down and trying to guard the bases as best they can and hold it off as long as they can. That's not good enough for the Umbral Pilots. They want to actually save the day. They're desperately trying to find solutions. Some of them are trying to find ways to save her. There's some way out there. For example, that's actually where the Triad live. The worm is not in Malpheus. The worm is in the Deep Umbra. Malpheus is essentially an anchorhead realm to the Deep Umbra.
Yeah, what we mage players would refer to as the Shen-Ti, which we only get vague information for.
Very vague.
Yes. We get the idea that, as you said, the Anchorhead realm, we get the idea that somewhere there is probably a connection between what mages would call the Radiance, what werewolves call the Flux, and whatever the Shen-Ti of dynamism is. We get the idea that Autochthonia may be connected to the Shen-Ti of stasis, but it's kind of interesting. It is a very dynamic kind of stasis as presented there, that you have this vast web of electromechanical life, and you're like, that doesn't seem that static.
I think it's because Whitewolf struggled with themes.
Yeah.
There was a lot of putting square holes in round pegs.
Yes, especially when we're dealing with the Triad or the Metaphysical Trinity. And one of the things I'd eventually like to explore is like, how do the technocrats view it? Like, what do they call it? And I always had the idea that the technocrats would discuss the laboratory, the market, and the scrapyard or something. And that would be their metaphor. And every group would have some sort of analogy, like that you would have the Apollitans who would talk about ecstasis, diegesis, and anagoresis or something like that. And every group would have that. So yeah, we have these metaphysical questions that are answered by going out there.
Right. And so they want to find these answers. There's a movement that's kind of obscure in Werewolf called the Wagnerians. It's been around for a long time, but we've never really talked much about them. The Wagnerians believe that there are other Gaias. There's a polygaia hypothesis. And if you go deep enough and far enough, you can go through the Deep Umbra and find other Tellurians that have their own Gaia. And some of the Umbral Pilots and the deserters of the Bonars are trying to move there to get away from this dying universe and find a new one. And so there's that.
When you say other Gaias, are they doing this in the Umbra, mundane space, or something else?
This is where it gets quirky, because space has a lot of meanings in the world of dark. You mentioned physical outer space goes up to a certain point, and where it is varies by edition and what that means. A lot of it's the asteroid belt, or out to the moons of Jupiter. And of course, more recently, you could argue past, out where Voyager is if you really want to. But there's physical outer space. There is ether space, which of course is that inland sea you mentioned. Then of course there's the ethereal, which goes out pretty far as well. And these are all sort of outer space. And the Umbral Pilots deal more commonly with the ethereal. It's kind of their second home. But they do interact with physical outer space, and they do sometimes go into ether space as well. There also are some relatively high-level gifts they can use to just step sideways into it instead of as well. They can get there. It's just a little trickier. But so they explore these things, looking for things that will help them, whether it's gifts or artifacts or spirits that can help them in various ways back home. It's ultimately about saving Earth, is what the Umbral Pilots are really about for most of them. Some are trying to bail on it, but it's ultimately about saving Earth and saving Gaia, etc. And so they're trying to find things out there to help back home.
And within Mage, we have the idea that kind of the further out there you get, especially in the high Umbra, the more remote from regular human thought you are. And it makes sense that if the solution we had to save Earth were so simple, it would already be here. I would argue we already have the solutions. We're just generally unwilling to implement them.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And it's maybe a quixotic quest. What do I like about the Umbral Pilots? They may be entirely wrong. They're really committed to it.
And in Mage, we encounter the same thing that so one of the questions is, why do we care whether it's in the Umbra or not? Mechanically, we care because mages, at least in some systems, experience disembodiment, a disconnection between their material and spiritual form remarkably fast compared to the Garou. And I find it funny because I can't remember what book it was in, but it was like, disembodiment is a concern for the Garou. And I'm like, oh man, tell me more information. It's like, if you've been gone from Earth for a number of years,
like
equal to your gnosis or something, and I'm like, what? We have 4 weeks before things start getting weird, and ultimately 3 months before you're just boned.
Actually, a further twist on that, Umbral Pilots mentions this as well, but it's actually in W20 Umbra as well, where it mentions that Garou in the Deep Umbra don't experience disconnection at all while they're there.
Oh wow!
The clock stops when they hit the Deep Umbra, because they are half spirit. The Deep Umbra is as real to them. Oh, it's weird to them, but it's as real as Earth is.
I think that's kind of interesting that you could say that a mage that had a spirit tether of some sort, that had a companion spirit or had appropriate technologies, would experience a similar phenomenon.
I would think so.
I do like the idea of saying, no, you can only be in an umbral realm for so long. You can only do so much navel gazing before it would disconnect you. But you're out in this weird, wild space. No. You're still kind of connected. And the example we have of this in Mage, we have only spotty representation of places beyond the solar system. For us, we have, the biggest one is going to be the COP, the Copernicus Research Center. So the Copernicus Research Station was originally a location around a distant star, and distant in terms of mundane distances, but quite close in terms of astronomical distance. I think they indicated that it was at Proxima Centauri or Alpha Centauri or something like that.
I believe so.
And the interesting thing, to Hal's point regarding there being other Gaias, regarding there being other places, is that star was shooting off its own quintessence, which could then be used, and the Void engineers had to figure out kind of how to digest it. And then I was recently alerted to a weird thing that noted that extra Terran planets also have nodes of their own. They're just intensely weak. And in most cases, it makes way more sense just to bring quintessence or to redirect it from Earth. But we don't get the idea that people at the COP disembodied. And the reason there isn't anyone there is because there was a terrible Nephandic attack. It fell off of its thing and kind of collapsed in on itself. And you're like, ta-da, black hole, great. We had one cool thing and you knocked over our treehouse. And I do like that thematic fundamental split between we need to go out there to discover who we are. Sure, that's fun. We need to go out there to discover what are we going to need back at home, or the Wagnerians, or when I saw it, I assumed it was Wagnerian, and I'm like,
yeah,
that's
whatever
interesting.
you want to call it, Wagnerian. Yeah, Ride of the Valkyries.
Very different, very different valence to it on whether or not. And other people being like, no, we need to abandon this. And I like the fact that that also mirrors kind of the views of Ascension that one can have, where it's like, screw you, I'm in this for myself, versus no, we need to bring everyone along. And the other people were like, this Ascension thing is stupid. Why even bother answering this question? It is so remote that it's never going to come up. Let's just make things not suck. And for those people looking for information on covering that vast distance, we did get the alternative sphere of Void correspondence in Void Engineers Revised, which is more or less correspondence, but on interplanetary scales. So you're going out there, you still have this connection, you're looking for things. What do you find out there?
There are a few groups of Garou that have explored the Umbra more intensively than the pilots. And, there are, even if you're just exploring the Ethereal, it's vast. And there are all these massive spirits you can contact out there. There are gifts and fetishes and things you can bring back home that are helpful. Also, there's some of these interesting patrons that can give you powers back home that are extremely helpful. Some of those totems are very strange and very powerful and very quirky. You can find allies out there. You can find enemies out there, an awful lot of them. And you can find gifts or anything else. Basically, it's a wide universe. You can find whatever's there.
What are a couple of those antagonists and friends that you could find, just to give us a few specifics to latch onto?
Absolutely. A couple of them you could call tweeners for the Garou, that maybe friend, maybe foe.
Frenemies, got it, yeah.
You've got mages out there, for example, who are inscrutable and powerful. And in the Deep Umbra, there are a lot more of them than there are Garou. And out in space, there are more of them than there are Garou. And that's usually the powerful ones that are out there. And they could be friend, they could be foe. It really depends what you're up against. You can find some very strange entities like the Kaluan and the Zigrogler, or however you pronounce that one. Like I said, powerful spirits of all kinds of unusual descriptions out there. And some of the enemies out there are particular to the plate. Like, as I mentioned, the Kaluan, who I really enjoyed statting them up finally again. I kind of looked through the sources that we had and said, well, how do I make this work in 20th anniversary? Also, the Zig, trying to make them make a little bit more sense in context of the more modern systems as well was a lot of fun. You can find and tussle with those guys. And of course, the Vujunka I updated as well. They were a lot of fun to work on and actually kind of make them a little bit more mechanically interesting, I thought. The Void Engineers, of course, are officially enemies to the Garou, but the Void Engineers have always kind of marched to their own, beat of their own drum anyway. And there's room for some flexibility there. They're inherently not going to be happy to see the Garou out there, and so there's likely tension there. But there's some interesting ways they can kind of evade one another, and the space is big enough they don't really have to interact that much if they don't want to. But they have some things in common. They're both are trying to fight off things that are out there that want in. They're the Nephandi, and they're enormous entities that they serve, or they're the ones that they work with. I love the idea of a Garou pack on this Umbra ship getting in this massive space battle against this Nephandic Leviathan that's like 50 times as big as their ship. A little squadron of Void Engineers sees this thing and attacks it. So there's this, wait a second, aren't you the... Let's worry about it later. We got bigger problems to worry about.
And I really like the idea, kind of flipping this on its head. It's like, oh, okay, we're in the Umbra. We're in our weird little techno-mystical steampunk aetherite void ship or something like that. And we come across this massive ship. And you're like, oh, shit, technocrats. They're like, no, it's not. It's the SS Good Boy. I don't think that's a Void Engineer ship. And then your character's having this reveal that there is this werewolf space force that hitherto was unknown to them. Who are the Vujunka?
The Vujunka, they're very interesting, I think. They've been in Werewolf since first edition.
And we get one reference to it in, I think, Chaos Factor is the only place where Mage run into it.
They're these entities that are described as techno-sorcerers, so the rules didn't really give us rules for that aspect of them. Back in the day, I added that in. They're these entities that from deep underground, they're from deeper than even where the Black Spiral Dancers go, and they make even the Black Spiral Dancers nervous, where they appear to be in some way worm-tainted, and they enslave Banes and so on, and they use weird technology, and they experiment on humans, but they're these blind creatures from underground. And as I read about them, I came to the conclusion that they probably had to be from the Hollow Earth. That's kind of the most logical explanation I had for the Vujunka. And so you've got these entities from down below somewhere that are coming up and raiding the surface occasionally. They're very rare. But the spirals have been kind of having this uneasy running conflict with them for centuries because they'll even kidnap the Spartans because they don't care about the surface beings. And so they're these weird, inscrutable alien invaders with no faces except this gigantic mouth. They won't explain why they're coming, but they really are not friendly to us. And they made most sense to me as entities from one of the infinitude of Hollow Earths, which is also something that we can explore in Umbral Pilots as well, which has never really been mentioned in Werewolf because it's really much more of a mage thing. But even from the first edition, the Umbral Pilots, the little test Burba had there was actually about a guy building a drill tank, basically, to go down to the Hollow Earth. So that's been a part of Umbral Pilots as long as Werewolf has had them.
As you mentioned, in Mage, we also get the idea that the deeper you go down in water, the more distant, the thinner the gauntlet becomes, and the easier it is to cross over. And I like the idea now of drilling your way through.
Yes.
Or you drill through Earth for so long, you eventually surface on Mars or or a rogue planet or a distant thing, so that there is this other group that is going in to go out, as it were.
Yes. Or down into ocean trenches and things. So you've got those kind of entities out there that you can mess with.
And as you mentioned, we have the Kalawan, which are these described as spirit entities, but they are always materialized. They look like the traditional grays of mythology. It was originally intended in Mage as a way of updating kind of the changeling myth for modern times, but as all good ideas do, they kind of grew beyond their britches, and they're kind of one of three supernatural space entities we get in Mage. The other one you mentioned is the Zigrogler. There was a period of time where I was typing Zigrogler on my phone so much it became a suggested autocorrect, and whenever I tried to type zigzag, it turned into Zigrogler zag.
I love it.
Yeah. So the second one is the Zigrogler, who are these four-dimensional, time-traveling, reptilian, scaly entities that are kind of moving around. And then you could argue that we also have the Huija. And Mace the Podcast has done episodes on all of these. So we'll include a link to those in the show notes.
And as a plug, my book does actually have updated stats for the Kalawan, and the Shipyard actually has rules for one of their saucer ships.
Oh, neat. And those are brought into X20 rule sets, and we just haven't gotten those for Mage yet. So one of the things that I always find interesting is when you have other notions of technology. So one of the things I think that makes the Alien film so interesting is it really looks like technology in that universe kind of went in a different direction. That we have this weird set of electromechanical set of interfaces. You have this really weird keyboard. Mother as an entity seems kind of different than how we would build a computer. Werewolves have access to rage and gnosis and so on. What would we recognize about a werewolf Umbral ship, and what wouldn't? Like, what kind of makes it unique?
Okay, well, a couple things. One of them is that and this is actually one of the areas where it departed slightly from the original canon. The original canon, which was very brief and very sketch, basically said that they dedicate these Umbra ships to themselves and travel into the Umbra with it. Basically take a mundane rocket, dedicate it, and take it into the Umbra.
What does dedicate mean?
To dedicate something is where there's a level 1 right where you can make an object part of yourself effectively. In werewolf fandom, we often call it the right of pants.
Oh.
Because when you shapeshift, your pants shred unless they're dedicated. Dedication doesn't necessarily work that way. You can't dedicate huge things to yourself. In Mage, technically you can with Prime, but Werewolf didn't really have that. But there's this mention of they dedicate these ships themselves and then they step sideways and travel under the Umbra. I said, you know what? That looks to me like the other Garou talking about the pilots don't quite understand what they're doing. Oh, we think they're dedicating these things to themselves, and that's how they're doing it. When I said, well, really what they're doing is they're building these extraordinarily complicated techno fetishes. They're building these fetishes, so they've got a spirit binding them together. That's the core thing that's really different, is that they are spirit driven. Sure, they've got, a rocket engine or a fusion drive or something, depending on how they build it. But what's really making this thing really work the way it does is that it's got a powerful spirit bound into its core that infuses the whole ship. So it's a spiritual technology. They're usually star spirits are the most common ones. Because for one thing, star spirits are very powerful of the vastness of the reaches out there and so on. So they're they're really appropriate for this kind of use. So you will bind a spirit into this thing. What makes the Umbra ship really work is that you've got this spirit that will interface with the pilot. And so when you step sideways, when you're piloting this thing, it takes the ship with you. And it takes not just the ship, but anybody else that's aboard and anything that's in the cargo with you as well. So all of it, it's essentially a conveyance to take all the stuff with you that you normally can't do. That's one of the really kind of cool things about them is they are designed to convey this to far away across the universe. You'll have, scanners and things designed for stuff that you wouldn't need that for the material, like things to like detect the gauntlet level. Many of the parts of the ship are themselves fetishes. They're interfaced with this kind of meta fetish. Like the blasters you've got aren't, high-tech laser. They are blasters designed to channel the rage of, say, a sun spirit to obliterate the enemy with fusion power that way. So you're going to have some technology that might, in some ways, might look more primitive. It might be equally advanced, just with some very weird features built into it. One of the devices I really appreciated that I designed for it, it's called the Diggers unit, DGRS unit, which is short for Dorothy Gale's Ruby Slippers. Because what this thing does is it takes a spirit charm, the charm of reform, and applies it to your ship. What it does is it takes me home to whatever my home realm happens to be. And so the Diggers unit, you're out there in the deep dark, you activate this thing, it yeets you back to Earth, and more or less instantly, because spirits can do that, and it's much harder for other entities.
And kind of the way I view this as the technology works. It is using normal rules of both physics and occult physics to accomplish something. It is not kind of this cargo cult where we're just making it look like technology, but the power of the spirit in it is it just kind of makes it work in that one day, mundane science will be able to do these things. But for now, the intuition provided by the werewolf's understanding of spirit and the nature of things kind of lets them make it work. And then the spirit provides maybe power or a particular understanding or the understanding to act as your astromech or astrogation guide. And in Mage, the avatar is kind of doing the same thing, that there is a level of understanding that the mage has that they may not be able to easily communicate, that is just kind of making it work. And the technology they have is real. And again, one day, sufficiently advanced mortals and sleepers will be able to emulate that. But in the meantime, you just kind of have that bit that makes it make sense. In the same way that we periodically get these technologists that just seemingly have an intuitive understanding of the field that they can't enumerate to you. Tesla was almost physically incapable of doing anything mathematical in comparison to like Faraday or James Clerk Maxwell. But in mundane reality, we recognize the truth of what he was doing, even if he couldn't enumerate the reasons why. And that is kind of the vantage point from which I take this.
Very much so.
Yeah. Your void engineer group that sees an Umbra craft is going to be like, okay, it looks like us, but they're using these non-traditional fuel sources. Like the mention that you made mention to the Nephonic Dreadnoughts before, one of them is just powered by nuclear waste spirits.
Right.
And that is where they're getting the energy from. Like there's a spiritual component to it, but otherwise they still have to follow the laws of thermodynamics when handling what that creature is shedding off from it. So that kind of occult technology I find to be super interesting in the same way that it's interesting.
I do as well.
Same thing when you look at the technology of like a setting like Dune or something like that, where it's still highly technological, but it has different cladding to it.
There was actually a really interesting discussion where that void engineer I mentioned, the two of them geek out over space stuff together, basically. She ultimately takes him into the Traveler, her ship, and he's discussing with her, and he's like, this, I kind of recognize the lines of the thing. It has some similar lines to NASA's work because she works with NASA, but he's looking at the engines. He's like, I don't know quite what I'm seeing here. And she's, this is a star drive, regulated by a star spirit. And he's like, wait, what? You've got an EDE regulating your fusion drive? Yeah. Oh.
Yeah, EDE, extra dimensional entity.
He's like, I understand it's technology, capital T technology, because that's a term that the void engineers use for magic and science. It's just not technology that I quite get how it works, but I get where it's going.
In the same way that, for instance, I view things like a church service as a technology. It is a community spiritual technology, but it is a technology nonetheless. It is a tool that we have created to achieve a goal, even if it is spiritual or community as opposed to something more material.
And the pilots talk a lot about spiritual technology in my book. And they're like, we're advancing spiritual technology.
The thing that just kind of bowled me over was the sheer amount of stuff. If you could just pick 3 or 4 cool little doodads, like you already made mention to the digger unit, what are a few other neat items that someone might just be like, oh, wow, that's cool?
A couple of the items that I thought were a lot of fun. You've got the Pathstone module, which lets you make your own moon bridges, of course, on board your ship. I really love the idea of the Cairn Heart module, where you can build a Cairn into your ship. The SI unit, that lets you take a spirit and use a spirit as your ship's AI. You could have one that's in there permanently, or you could. I love the idea of you can even take your pack totem and plug your pack totem into your ship, and now it's your ship. Your ship is actually your totem. I love that idea. But for other stuff that's non-ship, there are some things that were a lot of fun. I enjoyed the gauntlet breaching charges, where that's a missile you fire or a bomb you fire from one side of the gauntlet. It blows the gauntlet up, and if it does it well enough, it blows up things on the other side too. I just love the idea of strafing runs in the Umbra, where you nuke some Pidex facility and you're never in the physical world at all. One of the things that some buddies of mine really joked a lot about was it's also the big book of hard suits, because there are 4 different hard suit models in Umbral Pilots. One of those is because, second edition Book of the Weaver gave us the Myrmidon, which is a very cool Weaver tech, but accessible to humanity hard suit. So I updated the Myrmidon to 20th anniversary, partially because potentially maybe a kinfolk player character could have one of these on a pilot ship, so he could like stand toe to toe with the Garou in more or less more equal footing than he would otherwise. I also updated, because you're going to run into these guys out there. Mage 20 gave us an updated and an improved version of the Allenson hard suit, but my own complaint is, where's the Martinez? So I updated the Martinez. I also updated the second edition DSCA, the Deep Space Combat Armor for the Void Engineers is in there as well. So a lot of hard suits, and of course, the one that's closest and dearest to my heart is Warg Saber Versatile Hardsuit, which is a fetish spiritual hardsuit designed by and for werewolves that'll shapeshift with them. And of course, the Plasma Clave. I saw your notes you sent me, and there was a Plasma Clave was in all bold.
You don't need anything else behind that. And one of the things that I really like coming out the other side of this is I imagine a game where characters somehow stranded on the mage side need to fix and recover kind of a werewolf Umbra ship to just get home. And it's just this thing where like the repair process is a didactic argument with the tool to convince it to work. So like one of the sci-fi tropes is kind of somebody arguing with the AI of a ship to convince it to do something. And in this case, it gets to be a little bit more anthropomorphized in the form of a spirit. And you have to convince the ship that, yes, we are humans and the Garou have this particular view of us, but our goal is concomitant with Gaia and so on. So
and we'd really like to get home.
Yeah. So manipulation plus empathy to repair a ship. One of the things that new locations frequently give us is we kind of need new systems. Like we don't really have good systems in Mage to represent like an Umbral torpedo. For instance, what systems do you add, innovate, or collect together in these 2 books?
One of the things I did in terms of collecting and doing some extrapolating was that you're dealing with larger and larger vehicles. Inevitably, you're going to need some heavy metal for breaking them. So this book has got so much research I did on like the big guns in the universe. It even goes farther in the Shipyard. I don't know if you've read that one yet.
I haven't read it. I have seen it though.
It goes even bigger on that. I do the 30-inch guns from naval ships of the World War II are in there. You've got actual nuclear weapons in there. It's madness. If you're going to have things in the scale, you have to address this. So I actually have a lot of that collected in this book just to make it usable. You're dealing with things like zero gravity, which aren't as much of a problem in Werewolf, because if you're in the ethereal realm, because there's some particular stuff going on there. You're just kind of weightless. It doesn't quite work like microgravity does in actual outer space. There are some particular stuff in some sources about that, but I do kind of collect that. But I did have to do some really detailed work and like studying and research on what microgravity does. And so I incorporate a lot of that in this book, how it might affect you when you're fighting, how it might affect you, the way you move. So I have rules for moving, fighting, and functioning in microgravity. I hadn't ever seen those in Mage. I was like, Mage needs this even more than Werewolf does. So I'm going to be here for my Mage players too, not just Werewolf players.
Even going through the Shipyard, it outlines what spheres are required for the construction of a particular thing. It uses the same background build pull point that we got. You even provide a set of spreadsheets to calculate costs for these things. And,
for the Mathaverse, yes.
Yeah, and any supplement that includes an Excel spreadsheet, I'm going to intuitively be drawn to. So
yeah, both my books have those, but the ones in the Shipyard are Mo Beta.
Yeah.
I also had to take another look at suffocation, a decompression. I had to do rules for those. That's in there. So I did a lot of this work so storytellers wouldn't have to. And there are a couple angles you can take with those things. I tried to make it simple enough to be usable, yet accurate enough to be at least have some verity. The World of Darkness is a very narrative system anyway, so you can only go so far with that. But I did try to strike a balance between a narratively and gamically useful system that still has some bearing on what would really be going on as well. What kind of window you've got to rescue somebody that's been exposed to hard vacuum. I cover all that in this book.
And we get updated rules for the Quila Machine, the
Yes.
a class of like cleansing ships. As you mentioned,
Yes.
we get a Kalawan Corvette. You just kind of cover everything.
I did a lot more looking at how disconnection worked. What happens to humans as they're disconnecting, what happens to Garou as they're disconnecting, what happens to mages as they're disconnecting. And I gave some more detailed rules. One of the problems I have with threat null in Mage is you disconnect, you become a spirit. And in a lot of ways, you're much less threatening as a spirit mechanically than you are as a high-level mage. I tried to incorporate some ideas I noticed in Infinite Tapestry and to extrapolate from those a little bit in ways that would make powerful mages that are disconnected much more credible threat in a game of Mage or Werewolf, where they can actually keep charms that are based off a bunch of their effects they used to use as mages. So while they don't have the flexibility of a mage, they've still got a lot of the raw power. And they might have better dice pools for it too than you might as a mage. One of the things that I love about the vault, about the Storyteller's Vault, and you mentioned earlier, you can do big bold things there that you couldn't necessarily do in the existing texts. I love that it allows writers to explore some of the weird corners that would never get published otherwise, and to really kind of dig in. Now, I tried to enter into writing this book with all the rigor that I would have wanted if I was submitting it to White Wolf themselves, but where you can really explore some of the kind of quirky corners of the setting and look at stuff that wouldn't really work as easily in most chronicles, but that could be a lot of fun to incorporate. And so you can do this kind of thing in the vault and can get there's some really cool stuff out there for those that haven't dug into it yet. And this book, I really tried to explore ways to look at the themes of werewolf and mage from a slightly different direction than we've historically seen them, but still fitting within the setting and with maybe a little bit of a different mood than you might be used to seeing, where kind of a much more hopeful, possibly quixotic, but hopeful take on the setting.
You've kind of brought up two things. So you brought up threat null. Do you either provide or make commentary on how this text would be affected by kind of the metaplot? Like there's a metaplot section in here. What are those considerations?
Especially if you're dealing with space and the Umbra, the Metaplot has a massive effect on your game if you're dealing with the Umbra. And so I realized I had to get into the weeds with that in this book, because how could you not? What the geography of space is varies based on what your Metaplot is doing. What the organizations and even the personality of the organizations is vary. Look at the Void Engineers of first and second edition versus revised edition and M20 and Void Engineers. There's almost no, you can see the through line of how they got there, but it's a massive cultural shift. The scale of their operations is vastly different because the cop is gone in revised and later. They don't have the cop anymore. They've been brought much closer to home as they're fighting a holding action in space versus getting out there into the deep dark like they were in earlier editions. If you use the Avatar Storm, how will that affect your game? If you use the things that are called the Malady and the Betrayal that were introduced in Werewolf, the 20th Anniversary Edition, where it's kind of getting its own Avatar Storm for the Garou, and that was actually carried over very heavily into W5. While I'm not crazy about the Malady and the Betrayal, I try to look seriously how, if you're using this, how does it affect your game? How does it give you tools you can use to run a chronicle? How can you actually use this to inform how you run a chronicle? I looked at, for example, if you're using the Malady and the Betrayal, where the Umbra is mostly shut off, this drastically affects the pilots. Are you having them desperately trying to get back to Earth, but the gauntlet is shut to them? And now they have to desperately find a way to get through a cairn to get back. What are some of the potential implications of these various metaplot events? I look at Bangladesh. I look at the Avatar Storm. I look at the Reckoning and how it reshuffled the Umbra. And so how do I take these things? And if I'm using them or if I'm not, what plot hooks can I get from these? How can they influence my game? You can't dance around the meta plot in those terms, like, because if I'm using it or not, I need to know how my universe works. And so my book goes, if your universe works this way, here are some implications that might work for how it might affect your chronicle now.
Yeah, I like the idea of End Helios. One of the things that's interesting about it is visible from everywhere. So to me, we have this weird position where it's suddenly this navigation aid. But I could see that it kind of imposes this dark taint, like, yeah, it'll really help you guide you to where you want to go. But I don't know if I want to put its coordinates into my system or something like that. I just like the idea of it being phenomenologically tainted.
And of course, W20 and Mage 20 kind of back away from it a bit. Like, sometimes people can still see it, but it's not always visible anymore.
Yeah, and then you have Society of Ether Revised, which is like, yep, and it's full of elves. And you're like, wait, what? Slow that brain train down. There are dwarves on End Helios. So like, yeah,
that's marvelous.
And you're like, okay.
That's so classically Etherite, though.
Yeah, that was a weird-ass book.
It really is.
Probably the biggest gap between the revised and the pre-revised instantiation in terms of what it did to the group. But it's just like
the revised Ether book is Society of Ether on acid.
It goes places. So some hard-hitting listener questions. Do you provide mechanics or suggestions for including Lisa Frank-style space dolphins?
While I don't include them in the book, I do have rules for that. It's the same as rules for Kane. You fight them, you lose.
Oh, entirely reasonable. Another listener question. I'm a fan of the 1E conceit that breathing in space is a paradigm feature. Does this book deal with this kind of classic silliness?
Okay. Classic silliness indeed, yes. Now, what space is different in later editions than it is in first edition. Where in first edition, space kind of is the Umbra. In later editions, it's not quite that way. So what you see in 1E is really describing ether space in a lot of ways. How, depending on the paradigm, mages may or may not be able to breathe in some parts of the universe. Let's say Hermetic can definitely breathe in ether space. And in my writing, I said, Garou can too, because they're used to being able to breathe in ethereal realms, so why wouldn't they be able to in ether space? They can't in physical outer space, partially because we have that going way back, because way back, I think it was Umbra the Velvet Shadow, the first one, mentioned that if you step sideways in the ethereal realm, you end up in outer space, and that goes badly for Garou. I do address that in the book, and I think it's a fun take on it. Lisa Frankman, I love.
Anyone with quiet above 3 or a chaos magic practitioner? These are vital, important questions. How does being in space, do alien moons affect Garou Fury and Garou Rage? And do vampires burn under the light from alien stars?
No, I do actually address vampires a little bit. There's not a ton about vampires in here because they're not a lot of congruence between vampires and space stories usually.
Yeah, because space stories are fun and vampire is not. Anyway, continuing.
I'm not going to argue that.
Yeah.
There is mention in some earlier sources where if you're in the penumbra at daytime, Helios is omnipresent. But the sun, it doesn't really come from sunlight doesn't actually come from the sun.
Yeah,
it just
this
permeates.
uniform illumination. Yeah.
So unless that vampire is in somewhere real secure, they're toast when the sun comes up in the penumbra. And so now out in space, it might be slightly different because you're not as near to Helios in some ways, depending where you are. But so alien stars, I would say my book doesn't talk about this one as much, but what I would say is that if you're on a foreign planet, the sun comes up, I would say vampire's still toast. Partially because you don't want to just toss out the themes of vampire quite so easily. I think that the game would be lessened if you don't have the sun be a threat to them.
Yeah, I am here though for obviously to me the answer to this question depends on what mood and theme that you want to go for. If the sun literally is the embodiment of God's judgment and it is only our sun, that's weird because that suggests like this remarkably finite divine creator.
That's part of why I like to let it still happen.
Yeah, whereas at the same time, if you take like the demiurge interpretation and the god
and
that
you've
curses,
escaped the demiurge.
Yeah, and now we have this weird vampire colony on other planets where they don't where they can
that's
work.
Okay too.
Exactly.
Depending what this says he wants to do. Like that's one that's very much storytellers roll your own. And the moon thing, I think, is actually a really intriguing question. Garou Rage doesn't come from the moon. It comes from Luna. And so are these foreign moons, are these shards of Luna, the Celestine? If so, then yes. If they're not, probably no.
And it asks the question of, I don't know if Werewolf opines on this, but does Luna include the concept of moon?
That is an interesting question.
And if it turns out that Luna is the concept of all orbiting objects, of all secondary followers, of all omnipresent intermittent nighttime objects, then yeah. I think that could be a really edifying moment where
maybe Gaia is just planet. So all planets are Gaia.
And Gaia looks a little bit different when you go out to some extrasolar planet. But I like the idea. Yeah, and I like the idea of the Wagnerians viewing that as a support for their belief. We woke up on this strange world and we were lost and hungry. But when the 3 moons appeared in the sky at night, each full, and we felt renewed by the blessed light of Luna, we knew the justice of our mission. We knew the truth of our mission.
That's good. I like that. And I like that. That's a cool theme. On the mention of the orbiting object, there's a interesting little thing in the Time of Judgment book for Werewolf. If in your particular apocalypse, the moon gets shattered, seeing its pieces that haven't degraded in orbit yet or whatever passing, each one of those counts as seeing the moon that night. So there could be giant fragments of the moon that each one triggers the Garou's Rage.
I like it.
Cool idea.
What makes a game of Mage or Werewolf in Space unique next to other sci-fi games? How can we introduce the major themes of the game in such campaigns?
I love this question.
My immediate thought is kind of what makes it different is, or at least to me, in a good game is, as you mentioned earlier, for a lot of people, it's pointing back at Earth. You are geographically escaping Earth, but you are not thematic escaping Earth. You are going out to get something to bring it home. You are going on that hero's journey that happens to be through space. You are exploring the world and you are changed by the process, and the person who returns is different. Kind of that, what makes it not necessarily unique, but kind of different from a lot of sci-fi is that returning home element. The other one is that meditation on what do we call technology. We all agree that a Kavadi techno fetishist is using technology, as are the Void engineers, as are the Society of Ether, but it all looks different and it all works. And that's something we don't get a lot. And just kind of the counter with the other and what does it mean? The other thing it does is it maintains ambiguity.
Yes.
The Kalawan aren't necessarily extraterrestrial, but they seem to look like it. So which informed which? And those to me, as someone who tries to think about space travel in it, what to you do you think makes this Garou werewolf space epic just different from other sci-fi besides the fact that you're a werewolf in space?
A lot of the same stuff, of course, but there are also a few other things as well. As you mentioned, the fact that although you're out there, it's about what's going on back home too. The world of darkness is fundamentally rooted, for better or for ill, in our world. And so if you drop that element entirely, it's a very different story. And so I think that tie to, and not just our world, but to the modern world, in whatever time period you want to set it in, it's very much a thing of its space. So you always have that tie back to Gaia in the case of the Umbral Pilots. Even if you're trying to find a new Gaia, maybe Gaia has been destroyed, you still are carrying Gaia with you in the chronicle, metaphorically. That's one of the big things. Another one, that space in both Mage and Werewolf works very differently than it does in conventional sci-fi. This is not hard sci-fi. This is a very weird, quirky. In Mage, you've got consensual reality. What is the consensus in these far-flung places? Is there a consensus in these far-flung places? The consensual reality angle allows Mage space to be spectacularly and kind of gloriously weird. I have this mental image I've had for many years that I love of there's this very like hard-bitten Void engineer crew, very like hard sci-fi-ish traveling through space. And this guy says, "Sir, there's something on the scope. It's moving really fast. And it just passed us. What is it, Ensign?" It appears to be a man in Manchu period costume doing a spin kick.
Yeah.
As he's using that to travel interstellar distances. And that is legitimate in Mage. You're not going to see that in any other sci-fi. It just isn't a thing. Mage sci-fi, and a werewolf too, because they're both in different ways about wars for reality. You can take that war for reality that's an underlying theme and bring it very much out in the open if you're dealing with Mage space or space and werewolf either as well. And so you can take some of those underground stuff and bring them in the open. If you read about the descriptions of what the Nefandi are like out in the Deep Umbra, they're not the guys that are hiding behind a bureaucrat's desk like they are on Earth. They're those wacky devil cultists that are eating babies openly. You bring the themes out visible out there. It's more overt, it's more explicit out there. You've got marauders who are, singing jingle bells while riding a sleigh in the season across the universe. You've got things like the Triad out there in the Deep Umbra, which to Mage, that's outer space. So you can go and meet these extraordinarily esoteric concepts and talk to them. That you're not going to get that in typical sci-fi. You can explore some of the major political ruptures of these groups without everybody having to clock in 9 to 5. You could have a chronicle where it's a generational ship that's escaping destroyed reality, but bringing the metaphysics of werewolf with you.
And I also like the idea that you make mention of, so what is the consensus when you're really far out there? In my head, I always broke Mage up into 65% consensus, 20 to 25% history and memory of the land, and then 10% just metaphysical. These are the rules of reality, where either the avatar acts as witness or reality acts as witness. Time travel is never coincidental that we provide it.
There clearly are some earthly foundations, I think is the term they use for that in Mage.
Mm-hmm. I like the idea of having your generational ship and being like, well, the ship is large enough that it does kind of generate its own little consensus. And what does that look like, and how does that change over the course of decades? And kind of last question. So and I'm going to kind of shift this, should we try and connect the street level and the intergalactic? Does it make sense to talk about a street level space game? Or alternatively, do you feel as if the two have anything to say about each other?
I think it's a fantastic question. I love that question. Now, a part of it is I would say that it's totally optional because I think that they don't require each other, but you can do it and it can be really interesting. Mage Revised was very much in a lot of ways, at least initially, about trying to bring Mage down to street level when it had had its head in the clouds for the previous two editions. Even Mage Revised had a lot of room for intersection between the street level and the cosmic. I think Mage is actually a pretty good guide on that. One way you can do it is you can choose to not have your chronicle reside entirely in that cosmic plane. You mentioned the idea, perhaps kind of a cameo appearance from some of the cosmic side of the game. Maybe the group has been yeeted out through some umbral realm, and now they got to get home. Well, maybe Umbral Pilot ship can help them. And so you can have a part of your chronicle, maybe a story or two that delve into this other side, and it's about getting home again. Now you're on the Earth, you've been changed. You're not necessarily doing that stuff anymore, but what it did to you out there can really affect what you're doing on the street level now. How is the character different now that they've been to Jupiter and they're dealing with trying to pay their rent?
And it's pretty easy to come up with a case where your character, for whatever reason, is a mission specialist or has been drafted effectively to serve on it. And maybe this apparatus, maybe Antelios was destroyed, and that was the big win. And you are dealing with being a decommissioned space marine. You are not needed. The world no longer needs you in some way. You are used to an environment where cooperation meant survival, and now you go to a PTA meeting. And what does that do to you?
You know what? You remind me of a novel by C.J. Cherryh, other writer I love. It's called Rimrunners. It's part of the Alliance Union universe, which is a very hard sci-fi setting. But a big chunk of Rimrunners is set in a very street level on a station that's in process of being decommissioned because the war is over. And the protagonist is a Marine who's been stranded on the station because the war is over. And she's trying to survive. She ends up ultimately getting on another ship. But there's a section of it that's very much about that street level. How do I live now that the universe has changed and I am changed in this kind of very cosmic war setting? But now she's like, I can't make rent. And one way that I think can work really well with the cosmic with the cosmic versus street level in the World of Darkness is one that is that I think you have a natural arc in a lot of long running chronicles where you start street level, and as your characters grow in power and influence and understanding, they may progress gradually, get more and more elements that are drawing them into a wider universe. That could be a really interesting dialogue and a really interesting transitional point in a chronicle, trying to clean up the streets of my neighborhood. But now there's a groggler here. And what do I do about them? Where do they come from? Now I deal with this more cosmic side of the chronicle.
The other kind of angle I like on this is a space wolf or something comes back and decides, like, okay, I'm retired. Something terrible happens. I no longer have the ability to step into the Umbra, but I know how a ship works and I know how to pilot a vessel. And this person decides to treat their block as their new pack and their new crew or something. What does that look like? The other angle to me is you pick something like The Warriors or The Anabasis by Xenophon, and the chronicle is getting home as you cross from strange realm to strange realm, just trying to get your ship just kind of hopping, hopefully back home, where victory is merely going home. And obviously you were kind of changed by that. If I were to pick a system for that, I would probably use Paragon, which is the system behind Agon, but that's just because I'm a sucker for that system. So we've gone through my list of questions. Again, just for the audience, the two books we're talking about are Umbral Pilots and The Shipyard, Umbra Ships Expanded, by Hal Case, available on Storyteller Vault. Link will be in the show note. Just go to Storyteller Vault and search Umbral or Pilot, and that will be the first result. Hal, do you have any other projects on the horizon, or is this your edition and you're done?
Oh boy, there's been so many interesting discussions, but there's actually been some really wonderful discussions I've had with other Storytellers Vault writers about doing other WAD space stuff. I've got some notes together for a lot of other projects that could potentially happen. Some of which are tied to that, some of which are more on other areas. For example, I've got half written a book that would ideally be another one of the areas. Is one of my little like weird fixations in the World of Darkness is the possessed. Fomori had Freak Legion, and then there was Possessed and Revised. And basically, I wanted to do a real deep dive on the ones we know and some entities we don't know. That would be a kind of hoping to do like a definitive work on the possessed. Fomori, drones, gorgons, Kami, and some Stranger Things. So I've got a couple that I've got some notes together for and I've been working on. One about a new mockery breed for werewolf, where I thought I love the idea of the mockery breeds, but the choices of actual specific animals didn't make a lot of sense from a Pentex business standpoint. So I decided to create one that's based off dogs as a real threat to the Garou, because dogs are man's best friend, and they're the first domesticated animal. So what would Pentex want to use against the Garou? That also is a huge insult to them. Literal mockery breeds. So I've got working on a book on them. So I wanted to do a book on different factions of dedicated Umbral explorers. The Sunlost to the Korak, the Umbral dancers of the Nuisha. These groups of I'm looking at doing a book on those different dedicated Umbral travelers, particularly focusing on the Wagnerian movement. Also, I had something sketched out for Rage Across the Underworld. So Werewolf meets Wraith on a more like heavy take in terms of like mechanically and thematically looking at the intersection of Mage and Werewolf, between Werewolf and Wraith, and one about doing deeper into Werewolf and Mage, Rage Across the Reality, looking at consensus and how it interacts with Garou, and also Rage Across Wall Street. I'm an MBA. So this is an interesting area looking at how werewolf interface. It'd be kind of a werewolf version of Rich Bastard's Guide to Magic. That and kind of a werewolf version of that.
I always wanted to do a Rage Across the Balance Sheet, which essentially allowed you to do metaphysical combat between firms. But
maybe we could collaborate on Rage Across Wall Street.
Yeah. In the fullness of time. But those all sound like fascinating ideas. And as always, the problem is there are too many of them.
Yes,
so,
always.
We look forward to talking to you when any of those hit the finishing line.
Thank you.
Hal, thank you so much for your time. If we're interested in keeping up with you, is there a place we should go to do that, or just keep our eyes peeled on the Storyteller Vault?
I do have a couple of spaces where I've been putting some stuff on. When I do Storyteller Vault work, I will post about it. I've got an Instagram channel, Arcanum House, ARCNUMHOUSE. I've got a channel the same on Facebook as well that I put. I haven't been posting a ton of them lately because of real life stuff, and also I've been working on some other things as well. But I will be putting updates there as more projects come down the line. I am going to continue posting weirdness and wackiness on those sources as well.
Okay, we'll keep our eyes peeled for the next Arcanum House publication. Hal, thank you so much for your time.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
This has been Mage the Podcast, where if we ever saw you kicking your way through space in Manchu period costume, we'd just let you vibe. This show is made possible by our executive producers who include Ben Vendelow, Oracle of Getting to Space using railguns and passenger compartments full of packing peanuts. Buck Gregory, Oracle of Getting to Space using ground-based slings, because that's not dangerous. Christopher Phillips, Oracle of Getting to Space using an exceptionally large seesaw and having your entire third grade elementary school class jump onto the other side at once. Guy Stewart, Oracle of Getting to Space using the much cheaper alternative to a space elevator, a space escalator. Jay Widener, Oracle of Getting to Space using very well-trained bees in tiny spacesuits. Josh Hillerup, Oracle of Getting to Space using Dougie Hamilton, the friendly space moose. Mikhail, Oracle of Getting to Space using, SpaceX or Blue Origin or something boring, but that actually works. Pokeji, Oracle of Getting to Space using balloons. Sean Gallagher, Oracle of Getting to Space using Project Orion-style nuclear propulsion, which I shit you not, one candidate for the blast plate was wood. The crew of Erebus, Oracle of Getting to Space using furious jazz hands and just believing in yourself. And a Saint UX player, Oracle of Getting to Space by realizing it's all just space, so technically everything is space travel. Additionally, Archmaster Andrew Edelstein, Archmaster Brad the Blue, Archmaster Dan Svensson, Archmaster Derek Semsek, Archmaster Leroy Bryce, Archmaster Morgan Aran, Archmaster Nathan Weaver, Alex, Alexia, Ambiversion, Anders S., Anon, Badurfi, Berto, Blaze Hibbert, Blake Ryan, Brandon, Bryce Perry, Bubba the Pale One, Chris Blake, Sin Chodas, Daniel Cuppen, Daniel Scribner, Darren Hennessy, David Roy, Dennis Osborne, Eli Levenger, Eric Schwenk, Fragger Rock, Friedrich Owl, George Lara, Henry Kraft, Ia Bolt, Jason Kennedy, Jason Vines, Jason W. Briggs, Jay Gatsby, Jeff Bryn, Jenna F., Jervis Johnson, John Magnuson, Jolyn Andes, Laws and Stuff, Joshua Heath, Kathleen Halperin, Chris Kinner, Leslie Weatherstone, Matthew Prohl, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Nibero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klaminoff, Oliver Schindler, Patrick McNamara, Patrick Mulder, Rachel Grace, Ricardo, Richard Bat Brewster, Robart the Robot, Rubem Joseph, Ryan Stray, Rob H., Ryan Kendi, Samuel Tobin, Starfish, Stephen Carton, Thrice Great, Vincent Hamilton, Walter, William Connolly, and William Martin. Our EP shoutout this week is to Friedrich Owl, and this gives me a chance to recite several owl facts born of me teaching children bird identification for about 10 years at a summer camp. Owls are zygodactyl, meaning they have 2 forward-facing toes and 2 rear-facing toes. But unlike most zygodactyl birds, owls can pivot one of their rear-facing toes forward to assist in gripping. Owls can rotate their necks 270 degrees. What I didn't know until recently was there's actually a blood pooling system that collects blood to power their brains and eyes when the neck movement cuts off circulation. That's pretty metal. A group of owls is called a parliament. This originated from C.S. Lewis' description of a meeting of owls in the Chronicle of Narnia. Owls can hunt other owls. Great horned owls are the top predator of the smaller and cuter barred owl. Barn owls swallow their prey whole, skin, bones, and all, and they will eat up to 1,000 mice in a year. When I think of owl facts, I'll think of you, Friedrich Owl. Rather listen on YouTube? Search Mage the Podcast on YouTube to find our full library there. If you super like this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at magethepodcast@gmail.com or at Mage the Podcast on Twitter. We have a hoppin' Discord community at discord.me/magethepodcast. Mage the Podcast is also on Mastodon, on dice.camp at Mage the Podcast. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform of your choosing or tell a friend about us. Also go to magethepodcast.com for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now go change reality. Bye.